So that's pretty exciting because in addition to soft shadows, which is the buzzword that people look at where, okay, you've got a shadow line on the floor, is it an exact binary difference between in light and in shadow, or do you have a nice smooth umbra and penumbra area in there? The probably more significant aspect that we get out of that is the randomized dithering and jittering and everything that goes on in there allows us to go ahead and have good high quality shadows on normal mapped characters. Now, there's a lot of things in Doom that are sort of limitations on what the technology does well that we just work around and you don't really notice them because we work around them well. One of the major ones is that if you have normal shadowing turned on surfaces that have a high degree of curvature encoded in the normal maps, basically like characters, and you see it's to a lesser degree on things like pipes and stuff like that in the world, the fact that it goes from binary light into binary shadow at a silhouette edge where you have normals that curve around that past the silhouette should still be directly lit gives you this very harsh lighting condition. Sometimes the designers crutch up for that by having fairly bright fill lights so that the shadow isn't very harsh. But when we wanted to do stronger lighting, almost all of the characters have no self-shadowing set as a flag, which is a hack that we do in the stencil shadow buffering, so that characters with this set will not cast shadows on themselves, so you don't get the harsh silhouette shadowing, but they still cast shadows onto everything else in the world. And there's a few things that this screws up where it's not really unique per character on there. It kind of batches things into the two groups, no self-shadow and global shadow. So no self-shadow things don't cast any shadows on other things. So you'll see this sometimes where two monsters standing right next to each other with a light off to the side, they'll both cast shadows on the floor, but if they're both no self-shadow, you won't get a shadow from one monster on the other monster. But the primary thing that this prevents us from doing is dramatic close-ups on characters with self-shadowed lighting going on, and this was one of the major limitations for what we couldn't do with otherwise very high-quality surface lighting. So the shadow buffers solve that very, very nicely in that you can have a light directly on a character even without an ambient light, and you get a soft silhouette on there, which really does what we need to on there. So the other things with the soft shadows, it's interesting when I've got it set up right now in my research engine where I can toggle between the original Doom render and a new renderer using mostly the same data on there. And soft shadows are held out as this, as a grand new feature. But for the most part, when you walk through Doom, toggling between between soft shadows and the regular harsh shadows in Doom, there's very few places where it really makes much of a difference. If you're just kind of toggling between them, somebody a little ways away from the monitor won't even notice it unless there are items that are set in as no self-shadow that wind up getting shadows on them. That's the only thing that you really notice when you're just flipping between it. There's a couple scenes where if you look closer, it's really nice to see a good soft shadow and everything there. But for the most part, it doesn't make a huge difference. Some of that is because, again, the designers know not to put in things where harsh shadows look bad, so they'll have a little bit more artistic freedom with that. But the primary benefit of it is going to be, one, getting proper self-shadowing, avoiding the silhouette edge problem on major characters, and we should eventually see speed-ups from this by unloading the CPU from the shadow calculations. However, at this point right now, the shadow buffer solution is quite a bit slower than the existing stencil shadow solution. Some of that is due to hardware API issues, where right now I'm using the OpenGL pbuffer and render texture interface, which is a god-awful interface. It has far too much heritage from bad X Windows design decisions in the SGI days, and I had some days where it was the closest I've ever been to switching over to D3D because the APIs were just that appallingly bad. Unfortunately, well, both ATI and NVIDIA have their preferred direction for doing efficient rendered texture. Because the problem with the existing APIs is not only are they crummy bad APIs, they also have a pretty high performance overhead because they require you to switch OpenGL rendering contexts. And for shadow buffers, that's something that has to happen hundreds of times a frame, and it's a pretty big performance hit right now. So both ATI and NVIDIA have preferred solutions for this, and as usual, they're not agreeing on exactly what should be done on it, and it's over stupid, petty little things. I've read both of the specs, and I could work with either one. They both do the job, and they're just silly syntactic things, and I have a hard time empathizing with why they can't just get together and agree on, on one of these. I am doing my current work on NVIDIA-based hardware, so it's likely I will be using their extension. The issues with the current hardware right now are the NV40 has a few things that make development easier for me. It has floating point blending, which does save me some passes on what I'm doing. We'll certainly have fallback positions so that anything that we do with blending we can do with an additional render and another texture copy pass on there to work for NV30 and R300 class hardware. But it's nice, and there's also the pretty much unlimited instruction count on the NV30 stuff, where there are times when I'm writing these large programs, large fragment programs, and it's nice to just be able to keep tacking more and more things in there as I look at it. But I know full well that I will eventually have to, in some cases, segment these into things that can run on R300 class hardware. But the other issues with just raw performance on the shadow buffers is that a lot of people used to think that stencil shadows, because of the fact that in the basic direction you would be rendering front faces, back faces, and silhouette edges, that it was going to be this large polygon count increment. And it is a lot of extra polygons, but what wasn't immediately obvious was that in all the cases that I'm testing so far, the shadow buffers actually requires more polygon draws than the stencil shadows. And the reason for that is, in all the demos that you see of shadow buffers, to make it look good and performance attractive and all of this, it's always a projected light with a relatively tight frustum. And you see comments like this in the RenderMan books where you say, well, try and make your shadow lights like a 20-degree spotlight and use a 2K by 2K texture, and then you'll get good-looking shadows and everything on there. The problem is that in games, 99% of all lights are omnidirectional point lights. And to render a point light with a shadow buffer, you need to have an enclosing polygon on there, which the most straightforward way to do it is to have 6 planar projections on there. Now, what happens there is that anytime that you have an object that crosses these frustum boundaries, it has to be rendered multiple times. And again, in your typical standard graphics demo where you've got a fruit bowl on a flat plane, the whole object fits inside one frustum projection, and it's obvious you only need one extra rendering of that geometry to create a shadow buffer, and then you use it. However, again, in real life, or at least real game life, we have many objects that are part of the scenery that, instead of being contained inside a light frustum, many objects contain entire lights when you're looking at parts of the room, which means that some of the geometry needs to be rendered up to 6 times on there. And even when it's only rendered on average twice, it's actually more polygons than you would see with the stencil shadows. So it's an interesting performance characteristic from there. But polygon rates on the hardware are really high now and only getting higher. So I don't think that's going to be a huge issue. Another factor involved is what you see with offline rendering tools that use shadow buffers a lot. You commonly have to do a lot of tweaks with the bias to get things exactly right. There's 2 kind of standard problems you have with shadow buffers that are artifacts. If you have the bias set too low, you get what's called shadow acne, which is where you get little splotches of dark shadow on surfaces that are directly illuminated because the depth values there weren't enough to bias completely off of the surface. When you've got jittered sampling on, that just gives you a little bit of a kind of a dimmer look on them with a little bit of extra noise. And it's not horrible, but it's still not something you'd really like to have. The other artifact that you get when you have biases too large is you get shadow pull away, which is when you've got a surface that actually contacts a floor, the shadow doesn't start, say, right at a character's heel, but it starts some number of pixels behind it because of the way the biases work. And that's a fairly objectionable artifact when you look at it, when you see benches and things like that with the shadows not starting directly at them. And there's a few things that make this difficult in a number of ways. One problem is that the depth buffer, if you use normal depth buffering for this, isn't linear. Because it has a perspective projection or perspective warp into the depth buffer. If you have a bias that's correct for something that's right in front of a light, it's actually incorrect for it when it's a long ways away. And that's a pretty fundamental problem with that. It can be addressed by, instead of using depth buffering in the actual real depth buffer, you could have have your fragment program render out an alpha channel that's a floating point value that's in linear object space, and you could have consistent depth values across everything like that. Another issue is that it's often, if you just programmatically add a bias value in, like when you're rendering or when you're comparing against it, you're adding a linear world offset to your nonlinear depth offset. You can sort of fix that by using polygon offset rendering to add a nonlinear small unit bias on there. A problem with that is you can add the offsets there. Several people suggest using the polygon offset factor calculation to offset from the slope of the plane. That's not usable in a robust real engine, because for any factor value that you get, you will eventually find some cases where tiny subpixel polygons have a factor plane calculation that is almost infinity, and you will get those things with, if they're multiplied by anything, they will drop in or out of your shadow map. And I saw that when I had some of those in there, where I would occasionally get 1 pixel out of a shadow map that would be clear to the light, even though it was completely inside an enclosed mesh on the character. And that was just because some tiny little polygon turned almost edge onto the light, and the factor value blew it out through the back of the world, and you got to see through that, which would show up when you had like a light that was projecting a long distance with a relatively low resolution map. You see the little bright speckles sometimes jumping through things. So the solution to all the bias problems is there's a completely robust, solid, great way of doing it that solves all the problems. And that's to actually render 2 shadow buffers, one using the front-facing triangles to the light, and another one using the back-facing triangles to the light, and then you combine those together to find a midpoint value between all of the surfaces. And that works great. I haven't seen any situation where that doesn't do as good a job as possible in there. Unfortunately, it means twice the shadow buffer and twice the triangle renderings for shadow buffering on there. The current plan of record is that we will probably be using probably back-face renderings as our default, and then we'll offer midpoint renderings as a higher performance or higher quality option at a performance cost. And again, this will likely become a highly optimized path for the hardware vendors. Another somewhat interesting aspect of the hardware interactions on this is it may very well turn out to be that 16-bit depth rendering, which is a mode which is almost not used at all by any current rendering systems. We like our 24-bit depth buffers for rendering views because we all want to render large outdoor scenes that easily swamp a 16-bit depth buffer. But 16-bit depth buffers may be very useful for shadow buffers. Not only do they take up less memory for very large ones, but they should render somewhat faster and sample somewhat faster, because most lights won't have these incredibly large frustum distances that we see with views on there. So there are a few things that become more challenging with the shadow buffers. There's issues with stitching together the multiple planes. Like if you do 6 renderings of a cube face to go ahead and make an omnidirectional light, you want to go ahead and have them meet up completely seamlessly and not having any double shadowed or double lit surfaces, and you don't want to have the sampling with the jittering and everything kind of noticeably change planar orientation at there. And that was something that took a little while to work out perfectly, but it does the job right now, and you really can't tell any difference on it.